Hello everybody, this is the Vintage Sewing Machine Garage. I'm making a video for all of you to answer a question that has not yet been asked of me, but after, let's see, since 2015, going on 4 years, you all have been watching my videos and hearing me talk about machines. And I've been using different words to describe the sewing machines that I believe we should save. And today I want to make a video to help clarify some definitions because I use certain words interchangeably, and I wanted to be sure to distinguish the difference between a machine that I consider worthy of a full restoration and the difference between machines that are what I call heirloom quality vintage sewing machines, and a machine that is simply vintage but not heirloom quality. And that sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but it's actually an important distinction to make. I have to tell you a story. I had a client come to me one time. They found some of the machines I had posted as available. They had been restored and I was offering them. Someone contacted me and said, "Hey, I see that you restore home sewing machines. I have one, and I really want you to go through it, take it all apart, and give it a full restoration." And so I asked her for the model number and the brand and so forth, and she gave it to me. And her sewing machine was an early 1980s convertible free arm machine that had the white brand on it. And I did some research, and then I responded to her, and I told her I would love to do a sewing machine restoration for her, but I would not restore her machine. I said, we need to find a good heirloom quality vintage sewing machine, and like I say, I'd be happy to do that for you, but I won't restore your 1980s machine. Now remember, this machine was it was her first machine. I think it may have been 1979, 1980, 81 or so. And it was the first sewing machine she had ever been given. She learned to sew on it. So that machine had a lot of personal meaning for her. And she really, she wanted it. It was a very nostalgic piece of equipment for her. Understandably so. But I explained to her why I would not restore it. I told her that largely, for the most part, when people are charged for the restoration, the full overhaul of a sewing machine, the vast majority of that cost is labor. It involves the vast amount of hours that I sometimes have to put into a machine to bring it back. And it will vary depending on the condition of the machine. It depends on the brand. Certain machine designs take longer. I've explained to all of you many times that the Singer 201, one of the most incredible machines ever made, takes longer for me to restore than some other models. And it will vary, and I guess maybe that's a topic for yet another video of how much time you should devote to different machine models. But in any case, I explained to her that I did not feel right taking money from her for restoring her machine, knowing that her machine was not heirloom quality. And she said, "Well, what is that?" And I had to explain to her. I said, some of the mechanical parts of your machine, actually a good number of them, are not steel. They are made of plastic. And it may have been very tough plastic when it was built. She had used the machine. It was starting to have some problems, and she thought, okay, I'll have this guy do a full restoration of it. And I said, you can do that. You can pay me to go through your machine. I said, but I don't know how long your machine will last. And none of us really know. I said it could last another 5 years, 10 years, or it could last a year, and it could break and be unusable. And I said, that's not a really good use of your resources when you're trying to decide how much time and labor, if you're going to restore your own machine, or whether you're going to pay someone such as myself to do that. And so, and I remembered that conversation, and I wanted to kind of share that in this video. Many of you may have a lot of experience in sewing. You may have grown up sewing. You may have a very old vintage machine that's been handed down to you. But maybe you have one like the Janome that you see here, and that was handed down to you. Maybe you own a vintage machine, but it's not necessarily heirloom quality. And this is where I want to talk to you folks about the difference. Both of these sewing machines are considered vintage because the word vintage can be applied technically to anything that's more than 25 years old. And for any of you who remember the 1970s, this Janome was produced somewhere, I'm going to say 78, 79, 1980, probably late 70s. And that's I'm making a guesstimate here, okay? It's approximate dating. So if this is a vintage sewing machine, as is this old Singer 15, which the serial number says was made in 1908 and still runs, it's ready for its restoration. If both of these are vintage sewing machines, then how do you discern the difference? What is the difference? What makes this machine heirloom quality vintage and worthy of a full teardown and restoration? And what prevents this machine from having the same classification? Why would I not consider this the same? Now, as I've shown all of you, if you've been following my rescue series, you know that I'm still working to rescue the old, the 1970s Kenmore free arm. And I often refer to that Kenmore model series as the last of the Mohicans because it's the last, what I consider to be heirloom quality vintage sewing machines. And it's from the 70s, I think 76 is the cutoff for the Kenmores. Well, if this is 70s also, why can't this be an heirloom machine? Well, that Kenmore, and I showed you all the Kenmore from the side, and you can see the Janome from the side. The Kenmore has a plastic cover to its hand wheel. The Janome, this is a hard plastic hand wheel with a steel clutch knob for the bobbin winder. It has a plastic side panel, just as the Kenmore did. Unlike the Kenmore, it has a and this is kind of again another example of the slow slide into plastic machines. The little door that covers the bobbin case area is also plastic, but the body is steel, the top is steel, and even the side door here is steel. So you might think, well, hey, why wouldn't you do a full tear down of the Janome, just like you would the Singer? Well, this is where you have to be a bit of a detective, guys, because there are machine companies and models that you can look at that are essentially the beginning of the end of the heirloom era. So how do you know, I guess, what time period to start looking? It really depends on the manufacturer. The beginning of the introduction of plastic into the drivetrain of vintage sewing machines, machines that are now easily classified as vintage, begins earlier than you might think. By the 1960s, companies, manufacturers, both in Europe and in the United States, were already toying with the idea and experimenting with plastic gears. Now, you can't give a general blunt cutoff for manufacturer and year because sewing machine manufacturers had different models. And when they would introduce a new model, they would often continue to keep producing prior models, at least for a time. Singer was legendary for this. In fact, they had models they kept in production long after the technology had moved on because they were tried and true. They had customers for them, and they had already recouped their investment in launching them as new models years before. So let's talk about, I'll just throw out a few manufacturer brand names and give you a rough estimate. I can't give you an exact year, but we can talk generally when you should start looking. So let's look at European brands, for example. Bernina, one of the most, has a very strong following in vintage sewing machines, Swiss-made machines. Some of the models from the Bernina company in the 1960s, some of the more popular machines that people purchase today are the free arm machines, I believe the 530, the 730, the 830. These machines, which actually are known for having one of the most narrow free arms in a convertible sewing machine, and they're fantastic when you're sewing clothes for children, for example. Those machines began to introduce plastic gears in the 1960s. Certainly by the mid to late 1960s. Just pick 65 to 70. And again, I'm being approximate. Don't hold me to the exact years here. But those machines have plastic gears. The Italian company Necchi that built and engineered some of the finest sewing machines in history, especially with their zigzag models that they began to produce in the late 40s, early 1950s. The Necchi company produced all metal heirloom quality machines until the early 1960s. Approximately around 1962 to 1963, they introduced a model called the Lydia. And that model had, in addition to plenty of steel, it also had some plastic gears or drivetrain components introduced. And this was done very slowly. Okay, so you may have literally had machines with all steel, and then they would start bringing in those plastic gears. The German company Pfaffe, with their German-made machines, they had lots of steel and iron in those machines in the 1960s, but they began to experiment with nylon. And you can imagine why they did this. There's a lot of competition in the 1960s. A lot of outsourcing is occurring in the industry with increasing numbers of imported sewing machines from Japan. And the Japanese have gotten really good at making sewing machines. And they're really underpricing both American and European brands. And so there's pressure to reduce cost. You can form a plastic gear a lot more cheaply than you can machine and prepare a steel gear for a sewing machine, or any machine for that matter. So another example would be Singer. Now the Singer company had a very large number of sewing machine models. And so when they introduced a new model, which was a continuation of their Slant-O-Matic series, you all have seen me do videos on the 300 series, that 301, that wonderful straight stitcher, and then the 400 series, and then the 500. Those are both, they're Slant-O-Matic machines, but they have, of course, multi-stitch capability. Those are both 1950s machines, all steel, very heirloom in quality. And then Singer introduced the Touch and Sew series, and it used a 600 numerical designation for the models. When it was introduced, Singer had been pulling cost out of the manufacture of their machines. So when they introduced that Touch and Sew, they begin with early 600 model numbers, and they started putting in the top of the Touch and Sew was made of plastic, as was its thread spool pin. And the bottom pan, such as the one I've shown you on the 301s, which was metal, the Touch and Sews now have a plastic pan. And so you can see they're desperately trying to remove cost, but those early Touch and Sews had steel gears. And they kept the steel gears. But as you go through the series and as we move into the 60s, by approximately 1965, those Touch and Sew models began to introduce plastic gears in the drivetrain. Now, you have to look. When you start seeing the Touch and Sew model 623s, 626, 628s, some of them have steel gears and some of them have plastic gears. Remember, the manufacturers were not touting and trumpeting, oh, we've got plastic gears taking place of metal. This was done very quietly, and the manufacturer would talk to the retailer and say, look, We are going to keep the prices competitive so you can sell machines. Plastic gears don't require lubrication, so there's lower maintenance, and they typically run more quietly than steel gears, although I've never found steel gears in my heirloom machines to be particularly noisy. But in any case, you can see how the plastic manufacturers were really marketing to the machine makers to use their products and to pull back on the steel. And the cost for the manufacturer would drop. So with Singer 1965, so you can see, and it's important to note that Singer kept a lot of its older models in production. So you could have the touch and sews with plastic gears, and yet you might have had something like a Singer 237 model that still was all steel construction, at least for the drivetrain components. The lid might be plastic, but the drivetrain was all steel. But eventually, as all of these older models eventually were discontinued, the new models have plastic gears in their drivetrains. Now, this Janome is vintage. The Singer is heirloom vintage. The difference, while the Janome has a lot of steel parts and it's a heavy machine, it's heavy duty, it may sew beautifully. We'll check it out because I'm gonna overhaul it in a different way than I overhaul my other machines, and I'll explain that in the next video when I talk about specifically what I call a light overhaul, which I would never do to an heirloom quality machine. They deserve better. For these machines, it depends, and I'm purposely being vague here, and I'll explain in the video on a light overhaul why that matters, why you would even do that. But the Janome has inside, it has nylon gears. Part of it is steel and part of it is nylon. And this is what I call a hybrid. Okay, so I really want to make that distinction in the video. The whole purpose of this video is to say there is a difference between heirloom quality vintage sewing machines and what I call hybrid vintage sewing machines. Lots of steel, lots of heavy duty motors, but they begin to bring plastic in. Now, if you compare this to a modern plastic machine, there's no contest. These machines are far superior in construction to current inexpensive plastic sewing machines, but they're not heirloom quality, okay? So now you can see why I had to tell that customer I would not give her her 1979, 1980s machine a full restoration, because I couldn't really believe in the fact that she could keep it as long and use it as long as she wanted to. And keep it running indefinitely. So there you go, guys. If you have a comment on what you think we should call heirloom quality vintage sewing machines versus hybrid, let me know. It surprises a lot of people because if you saw this machine at a yard sale or a thrift store, you think, gosh, look at that old machine. I've been watching this vintage sewing machine garage channel and this guy's talking about how old machines are awesome. I should get this, and maybe you should. And in the next video we're going to talk about these hybrids, and I'll mention to you when it's a good idea to keep them and use them and tune them, give them a light overhaul, and when it's time to say goodbye to them, but you never throw them away. And I'll share why when we get that video done. Anyway, thank you so much for watching my channel. I really appreciate you folks tuning in to the channel, and let me know what you think. What do you think is considered heirloom quality? Do you have a machine, and do you have one of these machines that's vintage? Maybe it's been in your family for 40 years and it still runs great. Tell me what you love about it, and what you think of the difference that I'm calling out here. I wanted to clarify this and hopefully make it easier for those of you when you decide how much time and or money you're going to invest in a vintage sewing machine. Thanks for watching. Share your comments below, and I will see you next time. Thank you.